In the winter of 1756-57, Frederick collectedly augmented and prepared his army for the inevitable war, which spring would bring. Sure, he could look back on a somewhat satisfactory end of his surprise attack against the Saxons. Thanks to their surrender, they wouldn't be a threat. He consolidated his control over the principality during winter. He expelled the king, who took up residence in Warsaw. Incorporating Saxon soldiers in his army provided 10 new regiments, not to mention the food, material, and capital his new conquest provided. The great powers wouldn't be able to use the electorate as a springboard against Brandenburg's heartland. But the Battle of Lobositz did not grant him the victory he so desperately required to knock anyone out of the war. The Saxon soldiers proved a liability rather than an asset. In spring 1757, 2 regiments disbanded for sedition, and another escaped to Poland. With the international anti-Prussian alliance gaining momentum, Frederick rightly worried about invasions against his kingdom once winter was over. The Russians would invade from the east, the Swedes from the north, the French from the west, and of course Austria from the south. Moreover, the Imperial Diet declared war against Prussia that winter, leading to an extra worry. The West now was also prone to imperial invasions. Frederick quartered in Dresden throughout the winter, building up his army and preparing them for the inevitable campaign through the Bohemian hills against Prague. In Prague, the Austrian Field Marshal Braun also prepared for the year to come. He divided his army into 4 parts. In Eger, he stationed 30,000 soldiers under Charles Marie, Duke Arenberg. If the French managed to reach Bohemia by spring, these had to link up with him. 50,000 quartered at Budin, 30,000 under Count Christian Moritz von Koenigsegg und Rothfels quartered close to the Lusatian border. The remaining 30,000 were stationed at Königgrätz. In April 1757, Frederick deployed his 120,000-strong army along the Bohemian frontier. They were divided into 4 separate units. The plan was to incrementally march into Bohemia across a 100-mile front. Their goal was to converge north of Prague. Prince Moritz of Anhalt-Dessau, commanding 20,000 soldiers, advanced towards the Eger Valley from the west. Marshal August Wilhelm, Duke of Brunswick-Bevern, commanding 16,000, invaded from Lusatia. The center north. Schwerin invaded from Silesia, commanding some 34,000. Bevern and Schwerin were to link up with each other at Sobotka and launch an attack against Jungbunzlau. Frederick would march via Lobositz with 40,000 soldiers and a 3,900-wagon-strong baggage train. On April 18, the invasion began. Count Schwerin embarked on his march. 2 days later, Bevern marched into Bohemia. Bevern commanded some 15,000 troops. He was aware that a 23,000-strong Austrian army under Count Koenigsegg quartered on his route near Reichenberg. He hoped they would move towards Schwerin once scouts confirmed the Prussians launched their invasion. This was idle hope, and that same day his vanguard already encountered some of Koenigsegg's soldiers. The Austrian commander immediately dispatched messengers to nearby strongholds requesting reinforcements. Meanwhile, in Prague, Field Marshal Maximilian Ulysses von Braun received news of Schwerin's invasion. The Prussian army accumulating to Bohemia's west and northeast unnerved Braun, who traveled to his force in Budin. He also ordered Duke Arenberg to move his corps from Eger to join him. On the late evening of April 20, Bevern arrived north of Reichenberg, where, as expected, Koenigsegg defended the town. They knew they had to delay the Prussians as much as possible. Some Austrian detachments were quartered to different villages. To their west at Gabel, Count Macquarie moved north to cut off Bevern's communication line. However, some of Bevern's hussars halted their advance and Macquarie was forced to return to Gabel. Meanwhile, General Franz Moritz von Lacy and a few of his soldiers rapidly approached Reichenberg as reinforcements. Close by, another Austrian force under Colonel Karl Prinz von Liechtenstein, numbering some 800 cavalry and 300 infantry, was reluctant to leave their position at Grötau to reinforce Reichenberg. Commander Georg Ludwig von Puttkamer quickly capitalized on this by attacking Grötau. After a brief skirmish, Liechtenstein's force was scattered. Puttkamer seized 60 horses and many prisoners. Liechtenstein hurried to Reichenberg, together with whatever of his battered force remained. Puttkamer followed him. In the late evening of April 20, Bevern and his army approached Reichenberg. He positioned his army behind a brook, separating him from the Austrians. They set up camp and built a bridge to cross in the morning. In total, Koenigsegg commanded between 14 and 17,000 soldiers. These comprised 14 infantry battalions, 15 grenadier companies, and some 3,400 horsemen in 22 squadrons. In addition, he fielded approximately 78 artillery pieces. The Austrians erected barriers and placed their batteries in anticipation of the battle. They put up their ramps on the elevation in front of Reichenberg and a thick forest to the far left. Letters survive stating that thick forests made it difficult for any kind of troops to pass. The Austrians were flanked by two rises, the Iser and Jeschke. They held the strategic high ground. Behind them lay several valleys encircled by elevations. Bevern commanded 15 battalions and 20 squadrons, 11,300 infantry and 3,100 cavalry. He fielded 40 artillery guns. It is safe to assume they enjoyed a slight numerical superiority. At dawn on April 21st, Bevern deployed his army parallel to the creek they had camped behind. The Austrian watchmen immediately informed their commanders battle was imminent. Koenigsegg too deployed his army in a long stretch from a hill in front of Reichenberg to the thick woodlands on their left. He reinforced his already strategically strong right flank, concentrating the majority of his army there. Lacy commanded this Austrian right. Liechtenstein, who arrived with his still shaken cavalry from the previous day's assault, commanded the Austrian cavalry. They took up positions in front of the Franzental. Koenigsegg held control of the Austrian center. After crossing the bridge, Bevern's men took their positions. General Hans Sigismund von Lestwitz commanded the Prussian left. The cavalry was concentrated on the right wing, commanded by Lieutenant General Friedrich Eugene von Württemberg. A few hundred hussars under Puttkamer were hidden away in the woods on the far right. Bevern took charge of the main infantry body. Bevern concentrated the main attack against the Austrian left, the least reinforced flank. Lestwitz advanced against the Austrian right to divert attention. The volleys of artillery on both sides marked the start of the battle. Because of the uneven terrain, occasionally the Prussian artillery fired straight into their advancing infantry. Not an ideal position to be in. Württemberg and his 15 cavalry squadrons launched the first assault against Liechtenstein. Both parties heavily clashed and fierce combat ensued. Meanwhile, the infantry continued their advance forward slightly to the left, but their advancement also allowed them to invade the Austrian center ranks entirely. The main body of infantry climbed the left slope of the Austrians' elevation. After exchanging musket volleys, savage close combat followed. The iron discipline of the Prussians once again proved superior, and the Austrian formations on the ramp began cracking. But whereas the infantry was already proving successful, the cavalry was in a more difficult position. They had launched 3 charges in a very short period, but none proved successful. Still, the Austrian cavalry drifted off from their infantry lines. The significant distance allowed the Austrians on the ramp to their right to fire away during the skirmish. It caused mounting casualties, with the Prussian infantry pushing back the Austrian defenders on the ramp to their left. The flank became exposed to fire from 2 sides. The Prussian cavalry retreated, unable to inflict decisive damage. But before Liechtenstein could recuperate, Bevern had already ordered the next assault. This time, 3 infantry battalions moved forward. They were tasked with climbing the Jeschke mountain on the Prussian right. They climbed through the forest only to outflank the infantry on the ramp. A brief skirmish broke out. During this skirmish, Puttkamer's hussars came into action. They launched a charge from their hidden positions, surprising the Austrian cavalry. When the surprised infantry on the ramp was routed, the Prussians gained an ideal position to fire away at the Austrian cavalry's flank. The confusion and damage the Prussian volleys caused allowed Württemberg to launch another charge with his dragoons. Again, they clashed with the Austrians, and another bloody, ferocious melee ensued. Meanwhile, Koenigsegg grasped the severity of the situation. Having had the strategic high ground, the Prussians now turned it around and were securely positioned on what had been the Austrian left. Bevern adequately used his momentum. He ordered the remainder of the infantry forward along in a straight line. It was time to take the center. They began scaling the slope. Battle ensued along the entire line as the Austrians were hard pressed and forced to give up more ground against the ever-advancing Prussians. But this didn't go on for very long, and many were pushed back towards the Franzental. Koenigsegg attempted to rally his men for a final counterattack, but the chaos was too much. Soldiers descended into a rout as the Prussian right wing nearly enveloped the main body of soldiers in a pincer movement. The situation became too dangerous, and Koenigsegg ordered the general retreat. Official documents written right after the battle revealed that the retreat was made in good order, covered by Count Lacy, who commanded the right. Ironically, his side, the strongest side, had barely seen any combat. In total, the battle had lasted for 5 hours. The Prussians suffered some 700 casualties, whereas Koenigsegg lost 900. Many of the Prussian casualties were caused by friendly fire. Koenigsegg's retreat allowed Bevern to penetrate Bohemia and continue the march towards the rendezvous point. Upon the victory, Brunswick freed the way which allowed him to continue his march against Prague. Despite poor road conditions and hilly terrain, the advance went rather well. Meanwhile, to the north of his military camp, Frederick told his brother that the upcoming victory would prove as decisive for the fate of present-day empires as Caesar's defeat of Pompey at Pharsalus in 48 BC had been for Rome. Perhaps a bit dramatic, but definitely understandable considering the importance of the upcoming Battle of Prague. Everyone was aware of its importance, and the battle would soon arrive. Thank you very much for watching this video. If there's a topic, battle, or event you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment. I would also really like to thank all my patrons and my channel members for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and you want to support my work, consider joining me on Patreon. For just $1 a month, you already gain access to exclusive Patreon content, early access to my videos, and your name will be featured at the end of every video. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.